basically this is a workshop to discuss the interaction between plants and human beings, specifically the psychological and mental interpenetration of these two very different kinds of life forms. I think of this course as plants and mind, and the way I like to teach is to just begin to lay out the basic pieces of what is a very complex interdisciplinary puzzle, and hopefully at some point your specialties, your passions, your interests will ignite the whole thing, and it will have then a dynamic of its own. We could discuss these matters for 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, or as I've done for about 40 years, 35 years. There is no end to it. And very few areas of human endeavor dissolve the disciplinary boundaries of Western academia as thoroughly as the study of human and psychoactive plant interactions do. There are important issues here in biology and botany, in biogeography, in ethnography and ethnology, in psychology and neurophysiology, in the study of symbols. The number of disciplines that have to be brought to bear on this subject is, I think, a central clue to how important it is to understanding our humanness. And I represent a radical point of view on these matters, and I don't imagine I was invited here to dumb it down. So, if you had Darwin, you'd get natural selection. If you had Freud, you'd get sexual repression. So you've got McKenna, so you're going to get psychoactive catalysis of consciousness, because that's basically why I think these ideas are so important. But before we get to that, let me just lay out some of the field. Human beings began their career, well, we can trace it back to the primordial slime, I suppose, but our animal career was a career of insectivorous vegetarian and fruitarianism, lived out in the arboreal canopies of tropical rainforests. And all animal species, indeed all life, tends to occupy an evolutionary niche and then stabilize itself in that niche. Termites, cockroaches, these sorts of organisms found their niche hundreds of millions of years ago and filled it to perfection and have occupied it ever since. Generally, nature is not progressive in its particulars. Overall, nature is progressive, but its particulars seek equilibrium. And so it would have been in the case of our primate ancestors. They achieved a dynamical balance, as I said, a diet of insects and fruit, a canopy habitat, language of pack signaling designed to convey danger and information about food sources and so forth and so on. And there they would have remained had it not been for the larger ecodynamics of the planet, ecodynamics which are still shaping human habitat in Africa. Because what has been going on in Africa for at least 5 million years is a slow drying of the continent. And it disrupted this rainforest ecology so that about 2 to 4 million years ago, I mean, these are vast spans of time we're talking about, the rainforest began to island itself and to be restricted to the wetter areas parts of Africa and into the new environment, the more xerophytic or arid environment that was coming into being, a very diminished plant community took hold, a community of opportunistic grasses, annuals, heavy cedars, this sort of thing. Now we know that the rainforest was primary because the rainforest, just to give you a broad notion, might consist of over 100,000 plant species. The grassland ecosystem might well consist of under 500 species, and all 500 grassland species can be found as rare members of the flora of the rainforest. So clearly what we have are the survivors of a process of clearing. And there is argument among botanists about this, but Carl Sauer, who was a great geographer and thinker on these matters, held that there is no such thing as a natural grassland, that grasslands are the earliest artifacts of human impact on the planet. Grasslands are created by burning. They promote the growth of cereals and so feed into the human food chain. So our primate ancestors' ecological adaptation to arboreal life was interrupted by this process. And key to my thinking about all this, and those of you who are going to have careers in all this, I hope some of you will take it up and adumbrate it. I think the great overlooked factor in any model of human evolution, and indeed in evolutionary models of many other species, is we have not given enough emphasis to diet. When we talk about natural selection of an animal species, we tend to think that the genome expresses a physical type, and the phenotype is then subject to selection by natural environment. Some biologists have seen the thinness of this understanding. L.L. White wrote a book called Internal Factors in Evolution, in which he pointed out that the womb is itself an environment that makes a very heavy selection before an organism is ever born into the theater of Darwinian selection. So it isn't a tabula rasa that you're born into the theater of natural selection. You have been subject to natural selection from the very earliest moments of the existence of the zygote. So that's one factor. But what I have emphasized is diet. Diet is an input of potentially mutagenic factors into the body that can have enormous consequences on the health of an individual or the general evolution of a population. And I've used the toolbox of ideas that I'm going to put forward here today and tomorrow to try and address what seems to me to be one of the most centrally interesting questions to be asked of this world, and that is, what is human consciousness? Where did it come from? And why does it exist at all? And I believe that we can, by thinking about psychoactive plants, diet, and the early human evolutionary situation, we can make a lot of progress on this question. And we can illuminate some of our political dilemmas that persist to this day, the gender friction that typifies human society, the hierarchy structures and the tensions they create, so forth and so on. So let me run through this and get it off my chest, and then we can talk about the larger materia medica of psychoactive change relative to plants. As the rainforest retreated, our remote primate ancestors came under nutritional pressure, obviously, because their area for gathering food was being physically diminished. Now, when as you probably know or have observed, most animal species are very particular about their food intake. And if you've ever tried to raise butterflies or something for your children, you know that if you capture a caterpillar in the wild but don't pay close attention to the plant you find it on, you can't just put grass in a peanut butter jar with a caterpillar and expect great success. Animals are highly specialized in their choice of foods. Why is this? Well, as near as we can tell, eating all kinds of foods from an evolutionary point of view is a very reckless move indeed, because plants represent chemical smorgasbords of various types that have accumulated over time in the genome of a particular organism. If you have a very broad-based diet, you are exposing yourself to many different kinds of mutagenic influences. As a strategy for survival of a species, this is not good. Much better to specialize, to evolve special enzymatic pathways to deal with toxins. So, for instance, we know certain animals can eat things that other animals would become ill from or even die. And this is the way it's done. And all animal species tend to evolve toward these very bland monodiets. Now, what happens when there is an upheaval in an environment, a geomagnetic reversal, a volcanic eruption, a drought, something like that, and ordinary sources of nutrition become restricted? Then an organism has basically two choices. It can go extinct, starve itself out of existence, or if it has more flexible behaviors, it can begin to experiment with previously rejected potential foods in the environment. Rejected probably because of strong taste or something like that, which are clues to the presence of marginally acceptable chemical compounds of some sort. Our remote canopy living ancestors, as I mentioned, were fruitarian insectivores. They, under nutritional pressure, began to expand their repertoire of foods. They also began to explore the grassland environment. And I mentioned that the grassland environment is much poorer in total number of plant species than the rainforest. Thus, and logically, the potential number of food sources is also limited. Baboons and chimpanzees will dig with sticks for the corms, the swollen roots of grasses. So as our remote ancestors began to explore this new environment of the grasslands, they also began to explore new dietary items. And one of the items that they would surely have observed are coprophytic mushrooms, mushrooms which prefer dung as their environment. Coprophilic or coprophytic is the word for this. Many of these species of coprophytic mushrooms elaborate psilocybin, which, as I assume you know, is one of the major psychoactive alkaloids. Psilocybin occurs in many species of mushroom. It's unknown outside of the fungi. But I maintain that, in a sense, psilocybin is the best model for human interaction with a psychedelic, or that all other psychoactive plant usages are an effort to duplicate, return to, or somehow evoke the original human relationship to psilocybin. And here is and it is not simply its psychoactive properties that make psilocybin a potential catalyst for human consciousness. It is its psychoactive properties in combination with certain other properties that make it uniquely suited to carry out the role of catalysis of consciousness in a higher animal. What are these unique characteristics? Well, first of all, in very low doses, psilocybin increases visual acuity. If you want to go back into the literature, Roland Fisher in the middle 60s took graduate students and gave them small amounts of psilocybin or placebo, and he built an apparatus where two parallel strips of metal could be deformed by winding a crank. And he asked people to push a button when the two strips seemed to them to cease to be parallel. And he demonstrated that edge detection is enhanced by small amounts of psilocybin. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that edge detection is at a very high premium in any grassland situation where predation is taking place. The lion moving in the grass 300 yards away as it creeps upon your camp, or the gazelle trying to slip away through the tall grass from your hunting party. Edge detection is the key to success or failure in hunting in that kind of a situation. And it's extraordinary that we can statistically demonstrate this improved visual acuity occurring in the presence of psilocybin. What it would have done, you see, is these proto-hominids who would accept the psilocybin into their diet would have a slightly enhanced success in hunting. That slightly enhanced hunting success would mean more nutritional resources available for them and their offspring presumably inculcated into the habit of also eating the mushrooms. So what we have here is a slight favoring, then, of those animals in the population that would accept psilocybin into the diet. At slightly higher levels, psilocybin is, like all CNS stimulants, causes arousal. And arousal is simply a feeling of unfocused restlessness. You know, it's that 2 espresso feeling. Sleep is impossible. Hands are busy at small tasks. One is aware of one's sphere of awareness extends out somewhat further. And in highly sexed animals like primates, arousal means erection in the male. And this is very important for this theory because we not only have to account for human consciousness, but we have to account for the peculiar dislocation that human consciousness seems to carry with it, that we are both of nature yet not of nature, somehow creatures with one foot in nature and one foot in heaven. And how does this come about? I believe, and I'm willing to argue it against all comers, that a key element to understanding our sociology and our sexual politics and all that is to realize that psilocybin had two effects in the early human populations that were using it. One, we're very familiar with if we're psychedelic sophisticates ourselves. It's the psychedelic experience, the boundary-dissolving, hallucinatory, shamanic apotheosis that occurs with psilocybin. But the other effect is to medicate the tendency to form dominance hierarchies. And this is very controversial. In other words, what I'm saying is that all primates form dominance hierarchies. And what that means, just to remind you, is that the hard-bodied, long-fanged young males take control of the group. They control the children, the women. They order the old, the homosexual, and the young. Everybody is under their thumb. And part of our dilemma as a global society is that though we claim great sophistication, we still live under male dominance hierarchies. Corporations, universities, family structures, long-fanged males are still ordering around the elderly, the weak, and the female among us. And as we are conscious beings and reflect upon this, it creates great social dislocation and political unhappiness and tension in relationships and so forth and so on. I believe that our unique position in the animal world arose as a consequence of a chemical suppression of a natural behavior pattern. The pattern of male dominance, of forming dominance hierarchies, was interrupted by an item in the diet, psilocybin. And into this chaos, this egalitarian chaos, which resulted, was a situation in which everything about us that we treasure and hold up as human was put in place. In other words, theater, language, dance, story, altruism, ethics, metaphysics, did I say poetry? Everything that makes us human came into being roughly 100,000 in the last, from 100,000 to about 15,000 years ago. People lived in balance with the earth, with the larger biome in which they were embedded. There was not product fetishism ushering into enormous toxic processes involving the smelting of metals or the extraction of rare elements from the earth. Now, you could object and say, well, but they just simply weren't sophisticated enough to do those things. I maintain that our technical sophistication is a very specialized form of cultural adaptation, and that comparing us and finding us favorably compared to the civilization of Homer or Çatalhöyük or Altamira is simply a form of cultural chauvinism. Okay, but psilocybin had other effects besides this suppression of male dominance that I mentioned and this increased sexual thing, which I did mention, but I didn't draw the correct conclusion there. If you have something in your food which is, to put it crudely, acting as an aphrodisiac, then it is reasonable to expect that you will have more pregnancies, and reasonable to expect that you will therefore have, again, a tendency to outbreed the non-psilocybin-using members of the population. So we have two factors here. Increased visual acuity, which gives greater food gathering capacity. Increased sexual activity, which tends to outbreed the non-psilocybin imbibing members of the group. And then, on top of all this, you have this ecstatic internal state for which we, with all our cultural and epistemic sophistication, are still unable to come to terms. The mystery of the psychedelic experience. Now, these things taken together with other factors working in parallel created, I think, the dilemma and the glory and the opportunity of humanness. Once we began, under nutritional pressure, to expand our diet, we were delicately poised on the edge of omnivorousness. Because recall, in the canopy situation, we were insectivores, our remote ancestors. We were not simply vegetarians. We were insectivores. In the grassland environment, we began probably to originally to follow along behind lion kills and that sort of thing and eat carrion. One evolutionary theory says that our suppressed olfactory apparatus, the fact that we have a very limited sense of smell, is because there was a period in our evolution when we did a lot of rooting around in carcasses. This is not the noble image we might have wished, but there it is. If you need a countervailing theory, because you don't like that one, the other theory is, no, we lost our sense of smell because when we stood upright, we got our faces up off the ground, and that's where the smells are anyway, so it all sort of became useless equipment, and we dropped it. A point that I've become convinced of in the last couple of years, but is definitely not PC, is that I've noticed, and my attention was called to it by Philippe de Vaugelet, who's a friend of mine, carnivores are the most conscious of animals. Cows have very little interest in the habits of chipmunks or birds or anything else. All they do is munch grass. Carnivores, on the other hand, have an acute interest in the behavior of other animals. And in fact, I'm on the brink of willing to argue that the earliest consciousness was not self-consciousness. It was consciousness of how dinner thought. Because if you can think like your dinner, you can go out and plant yourself in its path of behavior and have dinner, you see. And if you will look at the difference between, a gerbil and a house cat, the intelligence level is striking. And I think that this attention to the behavior of other animals on the part of an emerging habit of carnivorous behavior is going to have to be taken into consideration. It's interesting that shamanism, which is in a sense the earliest intellectual pursuit, emerges in its early phase as a technique for identifying with animals. Hunting magic is what we're talking about here. And so I think that there was a very interesting mix of factors and players in the early human evolutionary situation. First of all, a canopy-dwelling primate with a pack signaling repertoire is forced into a grassland environment where psilocybin mushrooms occur, where small and large animals are predating upon each other, and where nutritional options are highly restricted. And as this animal makes its adaptive choices, it moves deeper and deeper into the realm of mind. First, the modeling of the behaviors of other animals and the behaviors of plants, because in a hunting-gathering situation, when plants produce fruit, what environments they prefer, what other plants they grow in association with, what soil types they prefer. All of these things are cofactors feeding in to an image of the world, and this image of the world, by its accuracy or falsity, decrees life or death upon those who carry it. The omnivorousness forced us into an awareness of other animals. That made us, that put us on the level of intelligence of a hunting cat or something like that. But the psilocybin experience at higher doses, and obviously by this time inculcated for sexual and ritual and hunting purposes into the society, also impels you into a non-local invisible, magical world that is, to use a Jungian term, highly numinous, highly charged with the energy of the archetype, of the archetypal world. And as I said, to this day, we are not able to come to terms with this. No matter how much Derrida or Husserl or Wittgenstein you've imbibed, it still is a very challenging thing to dissolve your ordinary state of consciousness and abandon yourself to the dynamic of the larger mind that we find ourselves embedded in. For a long time, therefore, up, let's say, numbers are numbers, but let's say from 50,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, there was a kind of paradise on this planet. Poetry coexisted with a balanced ecosystem. Observational sciences, astronomy, botany, biology, taxonomy, the observational sciences coexisted with the natural world. And then the same factors which created this Edenic situation, which remember what they were, it was the drying of the African continent that caused the rainforest retreat. That same process had been going on, slowly, inevitably, endlessly, and about between, after the last glacial melt, which began 20 to 17,000 years ago, Africa went dramatically dry. And the Sahara Desert began to form, where there had been a vast grassland dotted by sandstone pinnacles, cut by rushing streams, and crowded with vast herds of game. And that was the theater of human emergence. But when it began to go dry, it went dry rather dramatically. These ice cores coming out of Iceland make this clear. Nevertheless, as late as Roman times, the Roman historian Pliny referred to North Africa as the breadbasket of Rome, because they were growing wheat in vast amounts in North Africa as recently as 2,000 years ago, in areas now where there is nothing. Well, this paradisical African psilocybin matriarchal partnership, psychedelic, shamanic, archaic, whatever you want to call it, society was then pushed into crisis. And a number of things happened. First of all, migrations of people out of Africa. This happens every time there's a glacial melt. Human populations were trapped, or proto-hominid populations get trapped during the glacials, because the last glacial period, the glaciers came as far south as northern Israel. So human populations get trapped, and then in the interglacials during the melts, they radiate outward. People began leaving the Sahara, settling in the Nile Valley, and this shamanic use of psilocybin was disrupted because the environment which made it possible was disrupted. And when that happened, and this I'm closing the loop here for you, few of my raps are so sustained. When that happened, the pattern of male dominance, the pattern that was genetically never removed, but which had been pharmacologically suppressed for over 100,000 years perhaps, reasserted itself with a vengeance. It was always there. It had never been bred out. And it must have been an era of enormous brutality, when people's sense of things was that people were turning bad. Suddenly, we get a whole bunch of things come at once. An end to nomadism, the beginnings of sedentary agriculture, city building, standing armies, slavery, male kingship, dominance. All of these things appear just almost overnight. They spring up. And I maintain they are what a monkey would build as a civilization if suddenly all of its worst behavioral tendencies came to the forefront with a vengeance. And that's precisely what happened. In the period when we were self-medicating ourselves with psilocybin, we passed from being an animal into being the peculiarly spiritual entity that we are. We elaborated observational techniques, theories of magic, language. But when the psilocybin was withdrawn, these tools, which had been our glory, became instead our curse. Because instead of using them to produce theater and dance and ecstatic social interaction, we began to use them to support the new and older agenda of male dominance. And it's a frightening thing, to think. People following their cattle across the African plain, eating the mushrooms, seeing the mushrooms as part of the output of the cattle in the same way that meat and milk and manure were output of the cattle. A mother goddess religion, a religion of the land that moves lightly over the soil, no evidence of intergroup conflict, so forth and so on. And somehow, then, this process, which took a long time, of domesticating cattle, because I'm sure you can see how it all worked, how these factors were disparate, and then they flowed together. Human beings followed cattle because they were following kills of lions. You follow the cattle in the same way that the jackals follow the cattle to deal with the lion kills made by large predators. Well, then in the course of this, you encounter weakened animals or abandoned infant animals, and you care for them. And over 20,000 years, this turns into domestication of animals, husbandry of cattle. But you take away the psilocybin, and I think this is a frightening thing to contemplate. The earliest cities, I will argue, were pens for human beings. That's what a city is. It's a pen for human beings. Some of these dominant males said, well, we control cattle. Why shouldn't we control human beings in the same way? Why shouldn't a king order his people with the same impunity that he orders the slaughter and the movement of herds of goats and cattle? And all of the institutions that we labor under came into being at this moment of transition from the late Neolithic, or from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, to the agricultural situation. The reason for this, I believe, can be traced to the evolution of consciousness. I mean, consciousness is a double-edged sword. One of the factors, I think, that contributed to the reemergence of male dominance was that at some point, human intellectual capacity reached the point where a distant cause could be connected to an effect, and the effect and cause that were being observed was the sex act. At some point, men and women, presumably, but men must have understood that an act of copulation, if carried out successfully and in the right rhythm to the moon, will result in a child 9 months later. If you don't have that understanding, you have no sense of male paternity. So you have a very tight social bond, because for men, the children are our children, the children of the group. Once you have a sense of male paternity, then you have ownership, and this then becomes very problematic. At the very moment that men were figuring this out, women were noticing that in the yearly round of following the cattle, when they would return to the kitchen middens and fire pits abandoned a year previously, that there would be food in those areas, an abundance of food plants from cast-off kernels of cereals and so forth and so on. So then there is this awareness. If we bury food sources, then food will come out of the ground. The problem with agriculture in the early phase is that it's hideously efficient. And what it does is it immediately creates such a surplus that you have to stop moving. Nomadism has to be abandoned. You till fields and you overproduce, and then you must store and defend your overproduction against less fortunate human groups in the area. The most advanced building on this planet in 8,000 BC was the grain tower at Jericho. And what was it? It was a grain storage tower, and it had a staircase so that you could carry large rocks up onto the parapet so that you could drop them onto the heads of enemies who were trying to batter their way into your grain tower. So I've spent some time on this because this could be taught, this course, without any reference to our contemporary dilemma, which is, and by that dilemma I mean the dilemma of gender difference, male dominance, underutilization of females in society, underutilization of feminine points of view in society. But obviously there is a lot of tension in our society around the issue of psychedelic intoxication, around the issue of these shamanic plants, though there is a growing awareness among sophisticated people that the case is almost entirely emotional. In other words, we tolerate outlandishly toxic drugs, alcohol, tobacco. We're willing to make a trade-off of 70,000 deaths a year in this country for the privilege of driving the automobile, so forth and so on. We tolerate very toxic practices if they are seen to be somehow supportive of the agenda being handed down from the top. Psychedelics are not, and they are seen as tremendously disruptive, and yet, as the ethnographic and pharmacological data comes in, they are among the most benign substances in the world, and their history of human usage is almost universal. And then the question is, do these intoxications limit the spectrum of consciousness and allow hierarchical models to be handed down and brainwashed into the doubters? Or do these states of consciousness dissolve cultural assumptions and cast the individual into an ocean of existential perplexity out of which they have to build their own model of how the world works? Well, I believe the reason for this tension in our society and anxiety and suppression, furious suppression of these things, is because we sense that this addresses origins in the same way that it took a long time to overcome our queasiness about discussing sexuality. There's something about the origin subjects that make us very, very nervous. Okay, so that's a very linear discussion of the role of one psychoactive plant in human history, psilocybin. And as I say, I think it was uniquely, chemically, botanically positioned to play that role in human consciousness. Now, the contemporary situation worldwide is that we find many forms of shamanism, from the Arctic to the rainforest tropics, and shamanism always depends for its efficacy on a dislocation or a transformation of ordinary consciousness. And we see this achieved in many different ways, through fasting, through ordeal, meaning abandonment in the wilderness or flagellation, through elaborate theatrical effects, special effects, through the use of substances in plants. And there has been a controversy in anthropology, never resolved over the past 40 years. What is the authentic shamanism? And those of you who are anthropologists know that Merciliade, who was one of the great experts in this field, claimed, he called use of plants in a shamanic context decadent. He called the use of such plants narcotic. Well, first of all, the use of the word narcotic in that context shows you don't know what you're talking about in terms of pharmacology. That's a totally obsolete and silly category, and not true to boot. Psychedelics are in no sense narcotic. Gordon Wasson, on the other hand, who was a brilliant amateur and the discoverer of the psilocybin cults in Mexico, along with his partner and wife, Valentina Wasson, took just the opposite position and said, no, use of plants to transform consciousness is the primary method, where there is resort to ordeal, fasting, wilderness abandonment, so forth and so on. This is the derivative, late arriving, decadent shamanism. In fact, this is shamanism on its way to turning into religion of the ordinary sort. And in fact, if we look at religion of the ordinary sort, we see that it does have a place for fasting. It does have a place for self-flagellation. It does admit those techniques, but no organized religion of any size tolerates the use of psychedelics in consciousness transforming amounts. And that little parenthetical phrase is there because one of the things that you should know and remember and keep always in front of you is that if you wish to control someone, or if you want to brainwash somebody, the way you do it is with small amounts of drugs and large amounts of your message, whatever it is. So, but if you give people large amounts of a psychedelic, your message will take its place in the parade of ideas and find its relative importance. So using drugs does not mean, if you come upon a cult or a group or an individual using psychedelic substance, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are on a path of spiritual and shamanic transformation. It may be that they just are self-enforcing some private Idaho of illusion in which they choose to live. But if large doses are being taken, and by large I simply mean effective, full-spectrum doses. One of the wonderful things about these substances is that the effective dose is a long ways away from a dangerous dose. The LD50, in other words, is very favorable. The boundary, so then let me talk for a minute about the character of this experience generally. What is the plant hallucinogen experience in all times and all places for all people? I mean, I don't know if you can be that general, but it's important to try. What it is it's an experience of boundary dissolution. It's an experience of having categories obliterated, of having previously defined boundaries and differences eliminated. The enterprise of being and the enterprise of language is basically an enterprise of defining boundaries. I am myself, you are you, this is now, that was then, we are here, they are there. These are provisional distinctions about reality that make it necessary, that are necessary for us to keep track of and manipulate our animal body as a machine in Newtonian space. But when a shaman takes a psychoactive plant at an effective dose, he or she falls into trance, becomes immobile, and then the geometry of consciousness, if you wish, is melted and recast in a different geometry. And I use these mathematical terms because I really sincerely believe that at some hypothetical future date, when this is all sorted out, what we're going to realize about the psychedelic experience is that it is the experience of the fact of the higher geometry of the universe in which we live. In other words, it's very easy to see that ordinary consciousness evolved to, well, let me put it this way. It's a wonderful aphorism. Consciousness takes the contours of the vessel into which it is poured. It's like water. It always takes the shape of the vessel into which it is poured. And so what are we? We are, on the large scale, we are animals in three-dimensional space, given to hunting and given to being hunted. So what has consciousness done? It has evolved into a kind of threat, anticipation, detection, and avoidance machine. The purpose of consciousness, the purpose of your eyes, the coordination of your sensa is to navigate you through the world without dying, without being ripped apart by predators or being caught in landslides or rushing rivers, so forth and so on. And consciousness fills that need, ordinary consciousness, very well. But because the body has a locus in three-dimensional space, consciousness of the ordinary sort tends to surround the body as an object of concern. In other words, if you're worried about being hit by traffic, you're not worried about being hit by traffic in Berkeley. You're worried about being hit in traffic in San Francisco because that's where you happen to be. So consciousness of the ordinary sort tends to cluster around the physical body. But when consciousness is dissolved of that concern and dissolved of the programming in language that concern has built up over ages, it recrystallizes in a higher dimension, literally a kind of hyperspace. And if you will think for a moment about shamanism, I think you'll see how literally we can take this mathematical metaphor of the psychedelic experience. What is a classic shaman expected to do and be? Well, shamans predict hunting. They see where the game will be. Shamans predict weather. They can tell what the weather will be. Shamans are brought in to mediate complex social hassles of the who is sleeping with my woman, who stole the chicken, who shat in the stream kind of social hassles. Shamans are brought in for these kinds of purposes. And then finally and most importantly, shamans cure. They cure sometimes. Well, now, these things, predicting the weather, seeing where the game went, curing, and having a deep insight into social interaction, these are things which become completely non-mysterious if we hypothesize that the shaman has a hyperspatial point of view. You know, if you went into a mathematical if we had a safe here, and we could go into hyperspace, we would discover that the safe is open, that there is words are difficult here, but there is a side of the safe, or let's say a dimension to the safe, which isn't locked. In the same way that if a hyperspatial entity were looking down on San Francisco, it could reach into this room without coming through the door and rearrange things. In other words, everything that we call magic, seeing the future, seeing into locked boxes, knowing what is going to happen, becomes utterly non-mysterious if you hypothesize that consciousness can unfold itself under this peculiar pharmacodynamic situation into a higher dimensional space. And that becomes important in the modern context more than in the archaic context, because the collective future has become for us a focus of major anxiety. We need to know where we're going. You know, Marshall McLuhan said, the way we run our societies is like driving an automobile using only the rear view mirror. Well, in shamanically guided societies, they actually turn on the headlights. Running by the rear view mirror means you only have past experience to guide you. Running with the headlights on means you actually have an insight into the forward dimension into which you're moving. Okay, so that is sort of a broad sketch of how one plant, psilocybin, may have catalyzed, shaped, impacted human consciousness, how the abandonment of that archaic shamanic style through climatic change created the fall into history, how the fall into history is the absence of this hyperdimensional point of view, and then what we'll talk about when we come back after the break is how can we utilize the botanical and ethnographic and pharmacological data that we have garnered in the last 100 years to recapture, revivify, and explore this dimension of human potential in such a way that we can actually inject some hope into our political circumstances. I don't believe if we remain as we are, half angel, half monkey, ruled by dominance hierarchies, ruled by the most ruthless among us, that we have much of a future on the evolutionary stage. But I think that if we can recapture the lost symbiosis with these psychoactive plants, that we will in fact be recovering a lost portion of ourselves, that history is a progressive dehumanizing of the human experience, and we have now in the 20th century reached the level of dehumanizing where you've got the Holocaust, potential thermonuclear war, Bosnia, Rwanda, you name it. I mean, the scale of brutality, bruteness in the 20th century indicates to me that the struggle for the soul of humanity is reaching an incredibly intense crescendo. And I really believe that the path forward is backward, that we need an archaic revival, and that central to that revival will be the personality and the technology of shamanism. And when we analyze that technology for its effectiveness, we will discover that the most interesting things in the shamanic toolbox are the plants which directly intervene in the functioning of human consciousness. So let's just take a Are there questions to this point? Or shall I just keep plodding? Yes.
I mean, do we have to mainline men for the rest of throughout eternity?
Well, I think the implication is yes. In other words, had we remained monkeys, we never would have gotten into this crazy situation. We became human by forming a relationship, a symbiotic relationship with a psychoactive plant, and then we became semi-human when we abandoned it. And that's what we are now, semi-human. You know, we're capable of enormous acts of kindness and appalling acts of brutality. I think conscious self-reflection can help here. I mean, if you know this story and believe it, and if evidence, God knows what evidence would look like, but if evidence could be found to support it, then it makes it easier to understand our dilemma. I mean, men don't want to dominate, and it's not a man-woman issue either. Personality, the ego is a sort of genderless way of attacking this thing. The ego was suppressed by psilocybin. And in the absence of psilocybin, men and women became much more egocentric. And that egocentricity created all kinds of institutions which are very unflattering to us. So we need, I think, to, if this idea were accepted, that this is what happened, this is why we're conscious, this is why we're so uncomfortable with consciousness, and this is where we are, and somehow this dialogue could go on outside the distorting effects of Christianity, male anxiety, and so forth and so on, then I think the conclusion would be we need some very radical social reforms. Not simply, obviously, the legalization of spiritual transformation through substances, but all of our institutions have been built up on the assumption of ego and dominance hierarchy. And deconstructing that is really what the future is all about, I think, and it's a challenge. Does that go to it sufficiently? Don't be shy.
Except for I feel like, well, I also feel like just in general in this theory of the evolution of consciousness, female is left out. I mean, here we have the theories of erection and arousal and male dominance sort of tendency. I guess it's just that if a matrifocal culture can exist only under chemicals, what is the implication of that? I mean, yes, transformation is necessary.
Well, I don't call it matrifocal. I call it partnership. I don't think there's a pendulum swing between patriarchy and matriarchy. I think there is partnership, which is appropriate role expression. Everybody does what is appropriate to their position, and then there is the assigned role of the hierarchical situation. I think it was in Science last week. Here is a frontier that is breaking right now, which is it's just being realized that men and women are incredibly different anatomically. And at the microanatomical level, I think there was a list of 40 physical differences between the brains of men and women. And in a sense, and this is pure speculation, but I believe that especially in the archaic situation, well, we don't even have to talk about the archaic situation. In 1800, the average American woman gave birth 13 times. The average American woman in 1800. So you put a statistic like that against the phenomenon of menstruation, and what you have then when you look at women is a life absolutely rooted in the rhythms and the fact of nature. Men are sort of, it's more like a closed system. It's sealed off, and there isn't this connection into the biological world. So men are potentially more capable of getting off the track, if you want to put it that way, meaning leaving this Gaian creed of symbiotic self-reinforcement. It's very obvious in the years I've been doing this. This looks to me like a fairly balanced group, but my groups tend to be heavily male. And women, in my own experience, tend to be far more casual psychedelic users than men. If you just look at cannabis use, usually women are very casual. A woman who is truly a smoker is a rare, rare thing. Well, that would go along with menstruation and birth and breastfeeding. Women are involved in biology in a way that men need not be. They can choose, and that's why abstraction is the great realm of male activity and so forth.
I guess I want to take up your example of women in the 1800s giving birth so many times and point out that that also was an aberration that came from what I consider to be the learned behavior of males into domination. That when women were in control of their own reproductive cycle, there was not that many births. They were appropriately spaced because the sexual activity was not dominant. And the women determined when sexual activity would take place based on what was best for the community and the offspring.
No, you're right. I probably yield on that. I guess then, but I try to save the point by saying this. You're right. Probably in this archaic situation, women had knowledge of plant contraceptives, and they were well in control of
They were not forced into sexual activity, which was an important piece of the domination cycle. That women controlled the reproductive cycle and the sexual cycle, and so children were safe. It was when the concept of domination began that they lost power over when they would have sex, and then also how often they would have babies. And that was a real turning point in that reproductive aspect.
But don't you imagine that in a world without anesthetic, even if you gave birth only 3 or 4 times in your life, these would be immense boundary-dissolving psychedelic extravaganzas.
I don't have any problem with the conclusion. It's just sort of the pathway there and what the constructs were before that.
No, well, I think you're right. That such a large number of pregnancies and births indicates a pattern of subjugation. Yeah.
I just like to add something about gender. I think we need to be really aware of how biochemically mediated it is. I have a friend who went through a hormonal change. Became a woman over a 5-month period, hormonally. And you could feel his aggression drop away. And then 5 months later, he changed his mind and came back.
He hates being generous and loving. Get this off of me!
You could feel his aggression coming back, and now he's in a really, actually quite beautiful androgynous state.
Well, now I've seen it from both ends of the spectrum.
I really understand how women feel and how they think, and you just totally understand.
Oh, I know what I wanted to say about this. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you should be aware of this. And it's interesting. It's always fun to talk about sexuality and so forth and so on. But you're probably aware of these things called bonobos, these so-called pygmy chimpanzees. They're actually not noticeably smaller than ordinary chimpanzees, but they are a distinct species. First of all, we differ from chimpanzees by 2% of our genome. 98% of us is chimpanzee. We differ from the bonobos in about the same amount. Chimpanzees are male-dominant, highly monogamous, very territorial, so forth and so on. The bonobos, which are to a non-zoologist indistinguishable from the chimpanzees, all aggression is mediated through sex. Incredible. I'm surprised such animals can exist because I would have thought a virus would have jumped into this situation. but the bonobos are incredibly highly sexed animals. All forms of sexual activity are going on almost constantly, and all aggression and all social difference and everything is ameliorated by sexual activity, usually initiated by the female. Well, if you look at these two animals, chimpanzee and bonobo, you can't tell them apart. I think what it means is that this matter of our sexual expression and dominance and so forth and so on is riding on a cusp of some sort. We can go either way. That's why we're the only animal species where there is no defined style of pairing. In other words, we have monogamy in some societies, polygamy, polyandry, a whole smorgasbord of social and sexual arrangements that we will tolerate. No other creature is like that. And I think it indicates that we are in a zone of ambiguity on this matter, and that means we have a lot of leeway. We can send ourselves one way or the other. We can build a nightmarish, male-dominated, crypto-fascist kind of situation, or we can go the other way. Bonobo or chimpanzee, we're looking down both those roads.
Are you saying that basically as species we have lost that stabilized either the numbers or the
Well, we've been destabilized. I think we were stabilized in the chimpanzee dominator mode, and then 100,000 years of psilocybin use put us closer to the bonobos. Now, the bonobos are almost extinct. There's only a few thousand of them left. They need to be studied. There was a paper recently, I can't give you the citation, but if you write me, I can, studying chimpanzees in Africa. They would only leave the nest, they would only leave the trees and descend down onto the ground to forage, but the only thing they would do this for were mushrooms.
Well, curiously enough, the pygmy chimps are really the only animal where any success has been gleaned in the sign language communications and the more modern versions of that. But the pygmy chimps are the ones which can use the message boards actually to some effectiveness. The only ones that appear to have language ability, the hopes for dolphins, whales, and regular chimps is still a blank. But the pygmy chimps, they're doing it. So here we have the language thing come on the cusp for them.
So it would be very interesting to know if psilocybin, I mean, they might be an image of us 500,000 years ago. I mean, in other words, were we to go extinct and the bonobos to flourish, there might be another anthropoid species take the stage in 1 million or 2 years. Yeah.
This is the question to mainline the psilocybin. In my experience, I've seen many men, especially a lot of heavy hitters in the psychedelic movement, take high doses and don't care one hoot about gender issues or justice or equality. So I'm not sure that has, I think the psychedelic experience can reinforce all the oppressions that psilocybin itself can't necessarily open you up, melt down, and have to seek out justice.
Well, I guess I'm more of a believer than you are. I just say they didn't take enough. And and the other thing is, you mentioned these were heavy hitters in the male heavy hitters in the psychedelic movement. It may just be that some people can't be saved, that Christ himself couldn't lift some people out of chaos. I haven't had that experience. I mean, I think that...
You ask the women in the psychedelic movement about their experience. Because, I mean, you come from a certain perspective of male dominator. And you check it out.
What specifically should I ask them about their experience?
If they feel that the men in their lives change through strictly high doses of psilocybin or other psychedelic use, that there's more justice. I mean, my thing is that family is the most interesting football stage there is. Is there justice in the family? Is there a partnership model happening in the family? Is the father actively taking care of the children in the family?
Well, that's a sort of a different question. I liked your first question better. Do they see in the men in their lives a tendency toward a softening or justice?
But the stage of that is really relationship, the family.
Yeah, the problem I have with that is I think the modern family is, first of all, a very modern invention and basically a cauldron for the production of neuroses.
But that's what we have to work with. That's what we have to work with.
Well, let's ask these women, how about this proposition that psychedelics make men smoother, evener, more? Does anybody want to denounce that? Yeah.
In my experience, and I really use the word raise because that's all that's the culture that I've been involved with for the last 10 years. Combined, the psychedelic experience combined with the information as we're speaking, the reinforcement of the issues, the teaching of the balance, that it has been effective. Not on that scale, and I read the book last night, There's Revival, with the Timothy Leary factor of saving all the children, reach everybody. And as opposed to that, maybe reaching the people that want to be reached, maybe the creators, the artists, the philosophers of this time. I have seen that experience and very positive effects. But my life didn't see an intention. So it has to be, I believe it has to be backed up with some sort of teaching. You have to, and not some sort of like dominating teaching on either side, from male or female, but from people who now comprehend kind of oneness, basically.
You mean there has to be a supportive ambiance for it?
Yeah, there has to be some sort of...
Yeah, and part of what complicates it is notice that the male-dominated society we're living in is just fanatically concerned to suppress this. And to me, that's a sign that it must threaten it at a very basic level. And yet it seems silly. I mean, they're more concerned about suppressing psilocybin than, all kinds of obviously greater social ills. Why? Well, it's because it disrupts their model of how things should be run. Over here? Yeah.
I was going to say, I hope that we can assume that there are some men out there who aren't dominators and trying to sort of grind everybody else down, particularly women. There are men out there who have worked out relationships with women and with other men that are cooperative partnerships. Well, and a lot of them never took psilocybin.
Well, you live in a society, you take upon yourself the tone of the time. I mean, a lot of people wear tie-dye who never took LSD. You sort of take upon yourself the ambiance of your time. I don't really like the getting it into a gender thing. I really think ego, here's the way I put it. Ego is like a cyst which will begin to grow in you, whether you are male or female, unless you take a psychedelic. The psychedelic is that it will dissolve this cyst. The cyst is in your personality. It's a tumor. It shouldn't be there. I mean, we do need to have egos, little egos, so that when I take you out to dinner, I put the food I order in my mouth, you put the food you order in your mouth. That's what an ego is for. But if I start giving you orders, then that's completely inappropriate. So rather than genderize it, which I think is a mistake, because let's face it, after thousands of years of this maladaptive cultural style, many women are hard-driving, egomaniacal, ambitious. It's a bad style, and men may be born into it and women may be infected by it, but there's plenty of it around in men and women. Yeah.
I've been involved in the psychedelic sort of therapy, and basically people are drawn to it if they're willing to look at their own shit, and that's what the mushroom does. And seriously, that's what it comes from. And the person who's going to do that is like the dissolution of the ego, and it has reverberations for people who won't or aren't in a position to do that, or they're so involved in protecting their ego that they're not in that place yet. But that both men and women benefit from that, and it goes beyond that for people who will or will not use that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we should at some point in all of this say, obviously not everyone should take psychedelic plants. Well, then the question automatically follows, well, who shouldn't? Well, in practical terms, we all know people who are lightly here, who have diminished self-esteem, so forth and so on. For them, ego dissolution is not the goal. They have been so victimized by egomaniacs that they have no sense of self. So for them, they should be encouraged to build up an internal structure in their personality and a coherent reference point in the self. But that is a state of dis-ease that most of us are not like that. Most of us are ordinary or more toward the spectrum of ego dominance, and we profit from the psychedelic experience. Women, I think, are less excited by psychedelics because they experience, by and large, it has less of an impact. I mean, I've seen many, many people change their lives on a dime, like after a big LSD trip, but most of those people were men. Most of those people were men. Yeah.
What you thought about traditional indigenous cultures such as the Aborigines in Australia. I stayed with a group for about 3 months now, and I found it to be a very male-dominated, aggressive culture, and yet they were using shamanic and psychedelic plants for ritual and ceremonial use.
Well, I mean, here's what I think. Once this African paradisical partnership thing was disrupted and people were scattered to the 4 corners of the earth, the memory never was lost. And there is even what's called a nostalgia for paradise today, throughout time, the belief that in the past it was better. And since the Renaissance, it's been fashionable to dismiss this as a kind of naivete, the grass is greener kind of thing. But I think probably things were better, and that our nostalgia for paradise is what has caused us to be so subject to abuse and use of drugs. No other animal shares this pattern of behavior. Sometimes elephants will push down fences to get to rotting fruit, and birds get drunk and fall down on their little feeders and this sort of thing. But human beings addict to a startling spectrum, not only of substances, but of behaviors. We addict to each other. I mean, heroin withdrawal and a broken heart look and feel exactly the same way. Abandonment, bursting into tears, insomnia, inability to eat. I mean, does this person have a broken heart, or are they getting off junk? You can't tell. And we tend to addict. And I think this is a kind of, we feel in ourselves a certain incompleteness since the breakup of the African Partnership Society. And, alcohol doesn't quite do it. Cannabis is good, but doesn't quite go far enough. We've tried all kinds of things. And interestingly, in the last 100 years, the science of ethnography and anthropology has scoured the world and brought back to us data which we didn't have 120 years ago. Data about peyote, ayahuasca, datura, psilocybin, morning glory, so forth and so on. The materia medica of the remote human cultures of the planet is now available. And I think it comes not a moment too late. That's why I called my book The Archaic Revival. I really see the whole cultural impulse of the 20th century as an impulse toward the archaic. In other words, if you think about it, it begins with Impressionism. Well, what is Impressionism except LSD 30 minutes in? In other words, the sharpness goes, the colors brighten, everything begins to blur. The boundaries are beginning to dissolve. It's contentless. It's ideologically empty. It's just how things look. They look this certain way. Well, then 20 minutes later, ideas are beginning to accompany this melting and flowing of perception. We've now reached surrealism and Freud and Jung, the discovery of the unconscious. Well, then it keeps going. It gets more and more intense. Now we don't see dreamscapes, distorted gargoyle-like figures melting watches and burning giraffes. That has all been now replaced by just a blur, an energy storm. Now we're in a Pollock of some sort. We're down at the quantum mechanical level where energy is flinging itself around. And at the same time, things like jazz, which carried with it a heavy content of sexual looseness, the flapper era, that whole thing. People weren't Victorian ladies and gentlemen, that they had the cannibalistic drive, the Oedipal drive, the this drive. Hitler proved that, 500 years of Western ethics have you shoving people into ovens as a political course of action. The whole of the 20th century has been an exploration of the archaic. And then in the 60s, LSD appeared, but without the rhetoric of shamanism. LSD, for those of us who lived through it, was presented as the latest thing after penicillin and birth control. It was better living through chemistry. It was now we have penicillin, and now we have orthonovum, and now we have LSD. It was better living through chemistry. You've all seen the poster of the kids in the hate holding the banner. In the 70s, it was realized that the psychedelic experience need not be confined to LSD, it was generally realized, and that there were all these ethnographic usages, ayahuasca, peyote, datura, morning glories, so forth and so on. And then late in the 70s, the shaman became the paradigmatic figure for cultural emulation. And that's basically where we are now. The nation state is dissolving. It's a creation of Renaissance rationalism. Electronic media is retribalizing the world. Pharmacology is throwing open a vast cornucopia of psychoactive substances. And the legacy of psychoanalysis, modern art, quantum physics, and phenomenology have propelled us to the brink of a neo-archaic understanding of our world. And now it has to become more explicit. I mean, I don't think there's much chance of survival without a major effort to reestablish archaic styles and institutions. And it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, if you're idealizing 70 naked people with no physical culture who are following along behind their cattle on the plains of Africa, and you want to take their social institutions, psychology, philosophy, and aesthetic and lay it onto a global electronic culture of 7 billion, you're going to have to, there's going to be some creative twisting and turning in all of that. Nevertheless, I believe it can be done. Now, there's one more aspect of this that I want to touch on that's sort of philosophical in general, and that is we've talked about the psychedelic experience. We've talked about how it dissolves boundaries and changes cultural values and so forth. But what we haven't talked about is what is it exactly? I mean, what's so great about it? If you read a description of a psychedelic experience, it sounds sort of like, well, everything dissolves, you see a lot of bright colors, you have funny ideas, and then you have to rest for a day. Well, what is so great about that? I mean, why should that be a culturally transforming issue? Well, I believe that we misperceive the psychedelic substances if we simply think of them as an inert substance in a plant which, when taken by a human being, dissolves programming and shows you the basement of your mind, essentially. That isn't what's going on. I believe here is much closer to what's going on. Psychedelics convey information. The other kind of chemicals in nature that we're familiar with that convey information, aside from DNA, are pheromones. Pheromones are aromatic compounds released by plants and animals, usually to carry a message within the species. So ants, as you know, lay down chemical trails that other ants sense and can follow. Well, in a sense, hallucinogens are intraspecies pheromones of some sort. They carry information across species lines. And the kind of information that they carry, the message, is one of harmony, balance, and integration. And so a human population with a psychedelic institution or sacrament will, in its pristine form, tend to be nomadic, have very little physical cultural expression, tend to have a very loose family structure, an extended family structure and child-rearing arrangement. And I believe that this is where we can introduce the concept of the Gaian mind. The reason the psychedelic experience is so paradigm-shattering is because we believe that we are alone in intelligence on this planet. And what the psychedelics show is, no, there is a much larger field of mind than we ever could suspect in our ordinary state of consciousness. Nature herself is a minded entity, and information is flowing between species, between biosystems, across biota, gradients of light, chemical release, water, so forth and so on. All of nature is a vast communicating mind of some sort. And the only portion of that vast system that is out of alignment is the human world, because we closed the channel. We closed the channel by abandoning the shamanic institutions. In many, many human languages, the word shaman means go-between. Go-between. Well, go between what and what is the question. Well, the answer is go between the safe pedestrian assumptions of an organized society and the vast churning ocean of mystery that is real being. And every society is an illusion reared against the mystery of real being and pursued in ignorance of it. So the shaman mediates between these two worlds. The ordinary world people have to live in order to catch fish and have children and form relationships and bury the dead, and another unseen, dynamic world of energy, of process, of strange attractors, of the great unknown. But it isn't an abstraction. It's nature. And history is the consequence of an animal species losing its connection to the Gaian mind. And instead of then a Gaian agenda, integration, unity, cooperation, you get an ego agenda. Dominance, resource extraction, territorial acquisition, control of other human beings and resources. So when shamanism died, when hallucinogens became stigmatized, when the climate changed, we literally fell into history. We became a different kind of animal. And the consequences of untrammeled historicity being practiced for 12,000 years is to bring us to our present situation, where we have immense intellectual understanding of some aspects of nature. We have an immense ability to coordinate group activity in certain areas, like building a bridge, but not disarming, for example. But we have no ability whatsoever to control this darker self that sort of drew itself up to the campfire 12,000 years and said, you banished me into the darkness for 1,000,000 years while you lived in a psilocybin-driven paradise. But here I am again, and the piper must be paid. Now, all the cards are on the table, and it's up to us, we who live on this planet at the end of the 20th century, to try and do something with these facts. If we go extinct, if we wreck the planet and toxify the environment, it will be a tremendous tragedy because there are ways out. There are answers. But how much of the baggage we've accumulated over the past 4,000 years are we going to be able to take with us into that new world? Bloody little, I maintain. Our music, our mathematics, our dance, our theater. I don't think our technologies are going to be able to come with us unless they go through serious downsizing and detoxification. So really, the discovery in the 19th and 20th century of these ancient ways of relating to plants, it's not just a curiosity of anthropology or an exciting subfield of botany. It is, in fact, very central to the human drama of our salvation. Because I don't think we can fix ourselves through rhetoric. If we could fix ourselves through rhetoric, then Buddha and Christ would have done the job. We can only fix ourselves by consciously analyzing our dilemma and then intervening. And I believe these cultures that have existed in a kind of suspended animation in the rainforests of the world while Western European civilization charged through its merry adventure, the raison d'etre for the existence of those aboriginal civilizations is that they carry the archaic gnosis. It's all still intact for maybe 30 or 40 more years if we act quickly. The material is there, the techniques are there, it can be saved, but it has to be brought into modern civilization. And so, classes like this. And I will now offer a tremendously down interpretation of the same thing. These things are all alkaloids. It may just be that in this universe, alkaloids are always bitter, so that Gaia herself, it's like, can God make an object God can't lift? Can Gaia make an alkaloid that isn't bitter? I don't know. It's a challenge.
I know that alkaloids is bad. My question is that are these alkaloids something that we really should be taking? I'm trying to figure out the role of these switches in our consciousness. I see, I don't doubt that when we were pre-humanoid and we were running through the field and we saw a mushroom, we were like, okay, I can see it. It visually looks like something I can eat. It doesn't have spine. It's not running away. I don't doubt that it's probably completely good. Now we see fruit and it's colorful, it's sweet, and maybe the consciousness that we have when we eat fruit is just a different consciousness than we would have if we eat mushrooms. But I know that mushrooms taste bad, peyote tastes bad. That tour practically kills everyone that doesn't die from it. And
there's a recommendation. Well, I think we have tremendous resistance. I think the private issue, certainly for me and for probably most of you, it's easy to take psychedelics the first time because you don't know what you're getting into. Ever after that, you have to really have a little chat with yourself. And there are barriers to overcome. And in the case of the psilocybin mushroom, which is the hallucinogen, or at least I'm arguing it is here, when I first encountered it, it took years for me to build up a gag reflex. I really liked it in nature. It didn't taste bad. I used to say it tastes like cold water. That's what it tasted like to me. Now I do have a gag reflex, but I think that has to do with, accumulated association to it. Yeah.
Could you talk a little more about, you referred to, I think probably maybe the mushroom in particular, as being the most or one of the most benign substances, chemicals that can go in the brain or the body as a whole. It was very rewarding, but after waiting the first 90 pages of the invisible landscape, I'm getting the stuff that I can understand. Some of that was mentioned in there, and if you could maybe elaborate on it a little more.
Well, I guess it's important to talk about toxicity. This is an issue, and drugs, what you have to understand is all substances are potentially toxic. You can kill yourself with water if you will drink enough of it. In the case of drugs, the toxicity usually lies much closer to the effective dose than it does with water. Pharmacologists have a concept called LD50, which is a horrifying idea, but you should know it. LD50 is if you have 100 rats and you give them a drug, the LD50 dose is the dose at which half the rats die. And what you want in a drug, whether it's a psychoactive drug or a cancer drug or anything, what you want is a drug where the effective dose is many, many times lower than the LD50. Now, by that standard, LSD is the safest drug there is because you can feel 50 micrograms of LSD, and 200 micrograms of LSD is quite a full menu. But to kill yourself with LSD, nobody knows how much it would take. The LD50 for LSD has never been determined. It's so high. That's good news. Now, psilocybin is a mid-range in this way of classification. The effective dose of psilocybin is 15 to 30 milligrams. A fatal dose of psilocybin is around 150 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So you can figure out what that is. That's thousands of times or several thousand times the effective dose. Well, then something like mescaline, the LD50 is only about 40 times the effective dose. And by that measurement, then, you would have to say mescaline is a rather toxic compound. And it is, in fact. You have to take 700 milligrams. This is another way of talking about toxicity. How much do you have to take? Mescaline, you have to take 700 milligrams. That's damn near a 000 cap filled with pure alkaloid. LSD, to 100 micrograms, you can lose it on the head of a pin easily. So that's another way of thinking about the toxicity and effectiveness. And then there's one other parameter. How long does the drug last? If you take a substance and 48 hours later you still have your phone turned off and you're lying around in warm baths and wishing for a massage, then you took a toxic substance. It's not supposed to do that to you. It's not supposed to leave you with backaches and insomnia and a wreck. Well, by that criteria, then, DMT must be one of the safest drugs there are because it carries you to a titanically psychedelic state of mind and returns you in under 10 minutes to the baseline of consciousness. Now, it takes 70 milligrams of DMT to do that. So then that's, it takes a lot more than it does LSD. Now, interestingly, and then I'll let you go to lunch, we ran a little over, so we'll go to 12:30. Here's some new data that you may not have. A new psychoactive plant has come onto the scene with a new psychoactive substance in it, previously unknown to science, in a chemical family previously unknown to contain psychoactive compounds. And this new compound can justly claim though very little is known about it at the moment, and the experience itself is absolutely white-knuckle terrifying, can claim to be the safest psychedelic in the world because it only takes 1,000 micrograms, 1 milligram of this substance. Now remember, it took 70 milligrams of LSD. 50 to 70. 1 milligram of salvinorin alpha smoked will deliver you into a freakishly alien reality for about 15 minutes, and then you'll return. And we know almost nothing about this drug at this point. We don't know it's LD50, but it's only the second compound ever discovered that is active in the microgram range. It is an isoquinoline. It is in a chemical family unknown to contain psychoactive drugs. They've all been alkaloids or tropanes or something like that. Suddenly, late in the game, here is a plant. You can get high on the plant, although you have to work at it, and it's not dramatic. It's like the first half hour of ayahuasca or something. But if you isolate this compound and smoke it, it'll turn you every way but loose. And this is new data that has just come out. It should inspire those of you who are field botanists or ethnographers. There is a vast number of plants in the literature that are listed as suspect hallucinogens. What that means is somebody said, or some Indian told some botanist, we take this and we see things at night or something. Salvia divinorum was known for 20 years, but nobody could find the compound and nobody could get off on it. Well, now people are getting off, and the compound has been discovered, and they're looking at near relatives of Salvia divinorum, including a Ukrainian mint and some coleus species. And we're finding in microgram and smaller amounts a whole family of these new psychedelic isoquinolines. And what they will mean for us, it's hard to say. I mean, previously DMT held all honors for, weirdness, the depth of the call, as Heidegger likes to say. Now salvinorin alpha is on stage, and there's lots of work to be done. Yeah.
Or B9 was, when you've written about DMT, you mentioned it as very similar to brain chemistry that is already there. Or if we're all walking around in a serotonin hallucination and don't know it. And DMT, is it closeness in chemical structure to what's already there that you refer to it as benign, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly logical. It seems reasonable to say that, first of all, you don't want to insult the physical brain in any time, anyhow, because you only have one or two. So you have to keep care of your brain. It's very interesting that the most dramatic hallucinogen, and now I'm talking about DMT, let's leave salvinorin alpha out of this because not enough is known about it, but the most powerful hallucinogen actually occurs in human metabolism. Every single one of us, as we sit here, is elaborating DMT in tiny amounts. We're also elaborating 5-hydroxytryptamine, or serotonin, in quite extensive amounts. So I believe that ayahuasca, from this standard of judgment, is probably among the safest of the hallucinogens because it's essentially brain soup. There's nothing in it that you don't already have in your brain. It's just got more of it and in a different proportion. Oh yes, they occur in the pineal gland. 6-adenyl-glumerotropane is actually 5-hydroxytryptamine. 6-hydroxytryptamine. So a lot of these compounds are elaborated in the brain. LSD is not. Salvinorin alpha is not. Ketamine is not. Mescaline, close, but not. I mean, there are amphetamine-like compounds in normal metabolism, but that isn't one of them, yes.
A question that you might want to do after or when we come back. But it's a twofold question. One is, what is your opinion as to how these different substances open up different aspects? You know, each has their own little niche. And more specifically, if you could give me any point of view as to the differences of the, what opens up between a mushroom experience and an ayahuasca experience? How do they differ? And do you have any point of view as to the different windows or the different dimensions that different drugs open?
Sure. I mean, it seems to me, and somebody with equal experience might differ, but it seems to me that the best model is like a target or a bullseye. The various substances exhibit more and more of their unique character the more you take. In other words, if you take a low dose of something that's psychedelic, it will clarify your vision, stimulate you, and you can't really tell whether you've taken psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, or what have you. As the dose increases, the specific characteristics of these substances begin to emerge, and often they're counterintuitive to a chemical way of thinking. For example, ayahuasca and mushrooms, psilocybin is 4-phosphoryloxy-N-dimethyltryptamine. When you remove the phosphorus group, which happens as it crosses the blood-brain barrier, you get something very much like DMT. However, when you take psilocybin, you don't get something like a DMT trip. You get, in the case of psilocybin, the most startling quality of it is that it speaks. It speaks in English. It tells you things. I mean, this sounds preposterous unless you've had the experience. It sounded preposterous to me for years. I just could not imagine what my friends meant when they said these plants talk to you until I had a conversation with it. So psilocybin speaks, and it's a kind of a Spockian kind of message. It's about enormous machines in orbit around alien planets. It's about galactarian destiny and the history of the local cluster over the last 500 million years. And it's an enormous scale, and it's about races, worlds, technologies, civilizations, on and on and on. Switch over to ayahuasca, which is chemically almost the same animal, and it's about the waters. It's about birth, death, femininity, health and disease, relationships, energy flows between people. It's very human. It's very feminine. It's very organic. And in closing, well, these are quite different messages. I mean, if you had one in the absence of the other, you would have an unbalanced view, I think, of what is going on. However, then, if you take these things and push them all, do double doses or triple doses, I'm not recommending this, but I'm just saying it has been done and we have the data, what begins to happen is everything migrates toward the DMT flash. The DMT flash seems to be sort of like the center of the bullseye. Now, I haven't personally had enough guts to smoke salvinorin alpha. I've watched people do it, and if you're going to do it, I suggest you don't watch people do it. Because I was gung-ho till then. But assuming it lies somewhere on this spectrum, what seems to be happening is all of these things propel you toward deeper and deeper states of boundary dissolution. At the first level, you simply dissolve the boundary between yourself and the part of yourself you don't want to look at. That's called dealing with yourself. stuff. At the next level, you dissolve the boundary between yourself and other people. And this is the bonding situations and that sort of thing. At the next level, boundary between yourself and your memories of the past. All of your experience is returned to you. And beyond that, you dissolve then into what Jung called the collective unconscious or something like that. And then beyond that, Gaian mind, cosmic mind. I mean, I'm no fan of these hierarchies of named, hypostatized spiritual entities, but that's the basic idea. And finally, and astonishingly, I think the elf workshop of the DMT flash lies very close to the center of the experience, of what is possible. It is not simply, as you might have gotten the idea from reading the literature. You see, in the 60s, they wanted to map it over Buddhism or Eastern religion. And they wanted to say that as the dose increases, somehow Satori or Shunyata or Nirvana or the white light or the great void or something like that. I never had that experience. As I raised the dose, the complexity of the state complexified. It never simplified. It never became Neoplatonic. It became Borgesian, and the universe is full of a number of things. So I don't think we can, this is maybe time to stop, but I'm reluctant to connect this entire enterprise to what is popularly called spiritual growth. I just think it's more like about growth. And spirit implies some weird anti-materialist bias or something like that. I was raised Catholic. So to me, spirituality means, do you visit the sick and imprisoned? Do you clothe the naked? Do you feed the hungry? Do you bury the dead? Do you comfort the afflicted? This is when I see somebody doing those things, I say, this is a spiritually evolving person. When I see somebody taking psilocybin, I say, there is an explorer. But I don't try to lay on some moral judgment about good and evil. I think that's inappropriate. Spiritual accomplishment is manifested by moral action. And the role these psychedelics play is they may make moral action easier because they show you your memories and your depths and your mistakes, but intrinsically they are not tools for spiritual development. They are tools for the exploration of mind, and we don't know what that is. And we probably won't figure it out this afternoon, but anyhow, we'll come back here, and since it's now 12:30,